I'd like to get started here as we have a limited amount of time. My name is Angela Code. I am Saisi Dena First Nation. I'm originally from a little community called Tuduli Lake, Manitoba, but I've lived in Whitehorse now for 20 years. I've lived here since I was 10. So I'm really happy to be here today and to be the moderator for this speaker series. This is the third speaker series that the college has been putting on. And I'm really, really happy that you all are here. It's a great turnout. The first two events celebrated the 45th anniversary of Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. And then the second event was the 25th anniversary of the Umbrella Final Agreement. And today we're exploring two of the three Yukon First Nations that decided not to pursue a modern treaty and instead forged their own path towards self-determination. So before we get started and these two gentlemen will introduce themselves, I just want to say that I'm really happy to be living on the territory of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and the Ta'anquachan People Council. And so thank you very much for being here. Let's get started. First of all, Hammond Dick, could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Angela. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hammond Dick. I'm Crow Clan from the Casca, from Histago Dena, and just want to welcome everyone here to this discussion. We don't have much time. The topic we're going to be talking about is really extensive, so I don't think we're going to cover a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about within the hour. So thanks, Angela.
Name's David Johnny Senior. I'm White River First Nation. We're out. My dad and my mom is from the Scotty Creek area, right at the border. When the border was first cut out, my grandfather's house was right in the middle of that boundary line. And at that time, they gave us the rights for both sides. And the chief surveyor was Rayburn at that time. But those papers didn't ever make it to Washington. But I was asked to come here to talk about why we didn't sign. And you'll hear some of our concerns about it today, so enjoy it.
Before I forget, I just want to acknowledge Kwanlin Dun First Nation and Ta'anquachan lands that we are doing business on. So with that, where do you want me to start?
Okay, well, so it's often celebrated that the 11 of the 14 Yukon First Nations have signed the final and self-governing agreements. And for your First Nations, you decided not to sign on to these agreements. Yeah, I guess where we could start off is at the time of those beginnings of those negotiations, what was the vision of your First Nation? Like,
okay, I come from originally from Ross River. Our people call that place Tu'lidlini, where two waters meet, and that's been the traditional home for our people. And back in 1973, when I became interested in the world that we live in, I find that our people, the Aboriginal people, have always struggled with trying to come to terms with the settlers. And when I was growing up, my dad always talked about the highest law in the land. I didn't know what he meant until about the time that I learned what that was, and that's the Canadian Constitution. In 1973, Frank Calder and his people from Anishka, they launched a lawsuit with the British Columbia Supreme Court, and the court at that time, they ruled against them. So they decided to take their fight the next level up, and that's to the Canadian Supreme Court. And in end of January in 1973, the court, the highest law on the land, came close to a decision. They were split half and half, whether the Aboriginal people had title to the lands that they occupied. So at the time, the Pierre Elliott Trudeau and his Liberal government, they felt that they escaped the silver bullet there. When the highest court in the land said that that we had Aboriginal title, you know what they did? They went across the country. They said, okay, we're not gonna ask the highest court in the land to make a decision. What they decided to do was to negotiate a settlement with our people. That's when Chief Elijah Smith, and several chiefs went to Ottawa and submitted a proposal that a lot of you know about today. It's called Today for Our Children Tomorrow. Trudeau and his government accepted that proposal to negotiate a land claims for our people. That was, like I said, in 1973. I was barely out of school, but I hardly knew such words as implementation and negotiations or Category A lands or anything like that. But I'll tell you, in 1973, they launched a land claims negotiations to settle our claims in the Yukon. And for the next 6 years, they talked about setting out the ground rules. At that time, the Yancey, Yukon, the non-status, and CYI decided to work together. And that same year, Yukon government became a party to that process as representing third-party members. So that's where things starting to pick up at that time. So maybe I'll add more, but I want to ask David to maybe speak about his experience while I look at my notes.
So our vision when we first heard about this land claim issue was that we would have control of most of the stuff that's happening in our land, in our traditional area. And the first thing they did was they drew lines between all the First Nations. And there never was lines before. Everything that we did, the other First Nations, across the valley knew what we were doing. And there was laws applied to that in a traditional way. And then you have a non-native ruling that comes in, and they say, well, this is your land and that's their land. And I didn't like that idea, but most of all, there was resource sharing. We always seem to be at the low end of the stick. And when they brought the plan forward for, this is the process that we're going to do with the UFA, White River's at the bottom. And there was like land quantum. There was a lot of issues that just didn't add up to have a good agreement that everybody would be satisfied with. And it wasn't money. It wasn't, everybody always says, well, it's always compensation you're talking about and stuff like that. No, it wasn't. We wanted a clear view of our rights to that land and what happens to that land. In too many years, people just overran us, took our resources out, and never gave us nothing. We always end up, scraping the bottom of the barrel. And even if you look at the process under the UFA, White River's at the bottom. We have no land quantum. Even with the population-based process, there's just nothing there for us. And the more you look at it, the more you have doubts, because you have the elders that say, like William Peter. When I was just going to go to town, we kind of initialed a signature, the agreement, but I went to see William Peter, and he said, you see Macaulay Ridge? And he said, yeah. I said, what do you think? And he said, do we own that land? And I said, no. I said, but you have a say in it. But you have to really look at it. When you compile all the lands that we have, A, B, C, category lands, it really amounts to nothing. It's probably about 15 by 20 miles if you put it all together. And the rest of the land that's out there is mostly controlled by government, and we have a say in it, but we don't have the last say. And that really bugs me. So my dad said, his paper have a mind his own. But William Peter said, no, if I don't own that land, why are you going to sign it? That's my land. That's where me and your dad used to trap when we were young, he said. He used to be all over that hill there. And then years before my dad died, we went up top Mount Dave, and he said, that was right at the border. He said, you see, as far as you can see, he said, that's your land. He looked this way, north, east, south. It's all your land, he said, as far as you can see. He said, you go to the next hill, that's the furthest one. You climb that, and he said, you look the same way. He said, it's all your land yet. And it was just nothing in that agreement that that appealed to me at all. There was nothing there from the beginning when I looked at it. And I was somewhat involved in the Alaska land claims back in the day. So it was a hard pill to swallow, but at the end of the day, I think, we made a choice, and I think, we'll just go on from there.
I'm curious to know, how old were you guys when you first started getting into politics?
Well, I became chief at the age of 32. At the time, I was the youngest chief. And back in 1983, that was about the time I was on Ross River Dena council member. And at that time, I had an opportunity to take part in a number of these key meetings that land claims were being discussed at that time, both at the community level and both at the Yukon level. And there was a lot of opinions, I'll tell you, from within and outside of the communities. And 1983, there was a time when there was going to be a turning point for our people. We needed to be sure that the path forward was going to be in our favor. And whenever negotiations took place, we went back to the communities and informed them of what was being discussed at the table. We held community meetings. We even put together a video of these meetings, and we told our people what was being discussed. There was a lot of concerns. In 1984, the parties came to an agreement early that year, and in July or August of that year, they took that agreement to Tagish for ratification or approval to for us to go forward based on the package at that time. And about a year before that, the Casca community of Upper Liard and Ross River got together and asked legal counsel to help us interpret what was being proposed as part of that agreement. And they told us in plain language that these are the things that you're going to be bound to live with from here on out. So I'll tell you, in Tagish at the CYI General Assembly, George Smith and I did a presentation to the General Assembly. And one of the rules of the General Assembly was that any citizen or delegate can only speak 15 minutes on a topic. When we got up on the floor, we said, we handed out a report that analyzed the deal that we're going to be living with forever. So we started into our presentation, 15 minutes. The chair said, "Sorry, but your time's up." You know what I said? This is our People's General Assembly. Let them decide. So we asked them, "What do you guys think? What do you guys want to know? You want to hear more?" You know what they said? Damn right. We held that floor for 2 hours. And when we were done, there was a lineup to the mic. They wanted to know if what we were saying is true. So that was the end of that package. And another year go by, and we pick up where we left off, but with a different approach. With a different approach. They decided that this 1984 is not going to happen again. And it never did. So maybe at this point, I'll ask David to pick up.
Well, just read some stuff that I had written down. The focus of this presentation is on why our First Nation did not sign a final agreement. And there's two key themes: what we consider to be flaws in the negotiation process, and most recent legal development in and out of negotiations that have confirmed our view that the decision not to sign a final agreement was the correct one. I want to begin by stating the obvious. The choice of whether or not to sign a final agreement was entirely upon each First Nation, that we respect their decision. I'm not here to criticize any Yukon First Nation who signed a final agreement, nor should White River be criticized by choosing not to sign a final agreement. There have been many advantages for the First Nations on their final agreements, which we applaud. White River simply made the choice to make up these benefits to purchase our own vision of how to deal with our rights title and interest in other issues. There's one issue that kind of really bugs me was that surrendering your rights and title to this land. When you look at it, how long does it go on for? Huh? There's no set date that they're going to give you back your rights and title. They paid you out, so where that's going to leave you at the end of the day. The non-native part of it is that how long is that funding is going to last? One of these days they're going to say, well, that's it, and then here you are. You don't have rights and title to that land, and then you don't have rights and title to that. And what about your kids' rights and title, your grandkids, to this land that you signed over? And it just didn't seem right to me, and that's the part that kind of really bothers me. I also want to make clear that the White River still wants and needs to settle our outstanding rights and title issues and how to make progress on this front with YG and Canada. And why White River didn't sign a final agreement. White River is a small First Nation. Some of the aspects of the UFA-based negotiation and related benefits are based on population. For example, the settlement land quantum was not acceptable. White River did not get a land quantum which was comparable to other First Nations. The quantum was not based on our historic assertions on title and rights, but was driven by other consideration. That is another issue that we have. When we pick land, when they said, well, you guys go and pick your land, everybody picked land where their grandfather made a cup of tea or had a campfire. There's no value in the land that they were picking, and they kept us away from that point, from my personal observation of how it went. They just said, well, pick your land where, and we were led to that point to pick land where there was no value, it was just swamp. And then when we went back and we broke away from Burwash, we said, well, we want to pick land that has minerals. We want to have land that's going to have value to our selections. And YG was against it. They said, no, you got to stick within this area. You got to pick the land that you had. And as of August this past year, they lifted the protection. We had a protection clause on it. They lifted in August. So we have to sit there and we got to think about asserting our rights to say, okay, we own this land. No, but there's no piece of paper on Prime Minister's desk that says White River gave up their rights to any of that land from Silver City all the way to the border. So that still stands. That has to be dealt with. We followed their process. Now they got to follow our process, what we want. We have our own vision. We have kids to think about. We have generations of people to think about. And that's some big planning. And this is also related to the location of the proposed settlement lands. We have an asserted rights in the areas north of the UFA boundary based on maps presented to Canada and YG as early as 1990. But this is not recognized in the UFA, and in fact was summarily rejected by Canada and YG without any reason given. Another one is the collective-based Chapter 23 royalty and revenue sharing provision was deemed inadequate by our First Nation, in part due to the population factor. To be clear, the model would never provide anything close to sufficient revenue for our First Nation from development activities, nor does the model in any way compensate for all the resources that have been and continue to be extracted from our traditional territory. Based on precedents across much of Canada today, revenue sharing models have developed far greater benefits to First Nation. In addition to the revenue sharing issue, from my discussion with our First Nation who have signed final agreements, there's simply not enough money to implement the agreements. And that's something that you probably have to think about, because that's like, how many years ago did they sign? And like I say, I'm not here to criticize, but who's holding back? I don't think it's the First Nation. They have dreams and things that they want to do too, but they're not the one that's dragging their feet. And while that final agreement provides First Nation with harvesting rights outside of their settlement land, there's no meaningful consultation or engagement process between YG and the First Nation all settlement lands to protect these rights. We have, just because we don't have an agreement, if you look in the hunting regulations, it kind of just seems like anybody can just come and hunt in our traditional territory. You got to remember that we don't have no agreement. All the laws that's been grandfathered down to us from years ago, that our fathers, guarded this land, that applies to us yet. We have no agreement with Canada, and we have the right to tell the people to say, we regulate hunting in our area, and that if we ask you to leave, if there's too many people, we ask them to leave. We have that right to. The final agreement requires First Nations to cede, release, and surrender their title and rights, known as extinguishment. And that, like I said before, that's really a big problem with me, because I don't know where that's going to lead us or lead them eventually with their agreements. So, but it's some of the stuff that we have concerns about.
Yeah, I want to concur with David. David and I went to school together in at Yukon Hall, and a lot of the leadership that I grew up with, I've run into them in the past as well. Even the negotiators, we all grew up together. A lot of you know that Yukon is a small place. What David's been saying is that some of the fundamental issues that we had problems with as well during negotiations, and the extinguishment of Aboriginal rights was one, and it's still when you go to the table, that's one of the provisions that the government wants to see, that you extinguish all your Aboriginal rights before you go to the table. It's a precondition to negotiations. But I want to say that in the late '80s, the Casca community of Ross River and Upper Liard got together, and they decided to put together a tribal council that consists of 5 Casca communities in the Yukon and northern BC. Our traditional territory encompasses close to 400,000 square miles, and that goes into the western part of Northwest Territories as well. So one of the provisions before you go into the negotiations is that you submit a map of your traditional territory. And when negotiations began, Ross River submitted their traditional territory, and Upper Liard submitted their traditional territory. But we also have brothers and sisters in northern BC, and they were already in the negotiations with Canada to settle their grievances as well. But I want to say that in the late '80s, negotiations became pretty commonplace with all the communities, And CYI at the time allowed the communities to set up their own community negotiations to be a part of the overall process. And in 1995, when negotiations were coming close to concluding, CYI decided to restructure their organization in preparation to take on more responsibility for its organization. They put together a constitution to restructure that organization, and in 1995 they took that proposed constitution up to a General Assembly in Dawson City in July or August of that year. And up till then, both Ross River and Liard First Nation were a part of CYI. And during some of our internal structures with the organization, we find that that we were always being outvoted at the board of directors level, and we felt that that wasn't really what our people wanted. So we told the organizations that this isn't helping our communities. We told them that we want you to put a protection of the minority in your constitution. And for 3 days up there, we had George Smith talk to the executives to try to get that clause in there. Never made it in there. So at the end of the General Assembly, the late Chair Harry Allen said, "You're in, you're out, you're out." That was when we parted ways with CYI, because we felt that we weren't really taken seriously. So we left that organization in 1995. And they went on to where things are today. They concluded their band final agreements. I took part in a lot of those discussions. I saw them go through the process, both in the Yukon and in Ottawa. And I helped a lot of them go through that. And I also tried my best to leave an avenue open for our people to be able to go back to the table to negotiate a fair and balanced agreement for our people. When I was a leader in Ross River, I went back, talked to our people about what was being proposed at the table. I said earlier that they're quite concerned about what was being proposed. Our people lived off the land, and as David said, these are really important. This has been going on for the last 400 years, of us trying to hammer out an adequate relationship with people that have come into our country. And we've always said we're not opposed to having them live amongst us. But the political leaders, those that represent those people, they have a different view. And one of the things, before I hand over the mic, is that when we walked away from the table, the government said, okay, well, there's some things that we told them in Ottawa that we wanted a side table to negotiate a settlement of our own. But we don't want to be bound by the umbrella final agreement. We don't want to be bound by the proposed self-government agreement that was being put to the Yukon First Nations. Those are statutes that we did not agree with. With the provisions of those, telling us that these are some of the things that you're going to have to abide by. We were not happy with those provisions. You look across the country, there are similar structure, similar struggles from other First Nations. There are options out there. Before we walked away, the government said, okay, they sent us an envoy, Gavin Fitch, to talk to the leadership, talk to our communities, and go back and report to the Minister of Indian Affairs. And he did. 2008, March 27th, is when he submitted his report to the Minister of Indian Affairs, Chuck Strahl. And there are 10 recommendations for the government to consider. And to this date, you think they considered any of those recommendations? No, they never. You look that up. David?
Yeah, this all that stuff that I talked about before, it all ended up in the office down at Main Street when we were there that day to sign it. And the night before, I sat up all night thinking about it. And I thought, since I read those agreements that they had on the table, I knew it wasn't for us. I mean, I know some of my members wanted us to sign it, but it was, like I said, it wasn't a monetary issue. It was land and the rights to that land and the resources that came out of it. And they, the next morning we went there and we were that close to signing. We were all in that office ready to sign it. And I got up and I said, nope, told my counselors they had to leave. And some of them wondered why, and I said, we're not signing. And we left. And everywhere where we went, and we had politicians following us around, following me around, phoning me 24 hours a day and, saying, why you didn't sign? You were that close. And I had to explain myself over and over and over again. And, now we're in a process that I can't really talk much about it, but we're going to go back to the tables, but it's not going to be under the UFA. It's not going to be giving up our rights. And we're going to be talking resource sharing. And it's, like what I got written here is related legal developments. The federal government now follows a rights recognition approach and not an extinguishment approach, unlike the UFA. This is a proper and sound basis for negotiation and eliminates extinguishment, but that's not all reflected in the UFA model. And they always talk about we have to use that land. They use that term to say, well, you guys have to use that land up in the Donjack area. You have to use that land up in Pepper Lake area. And now they have a question out. They want to find out about was there Native people in that area before? Like, there was White River there? I trying to find that question. I seen it a couple weeks ago, and it was from the government. And I was just like, why do we have to keep proving ourselves to them that we've been here? We have a Little John site up there, and Norm Easton been there for years, and that's probably the second oldest site in Canada. one of the oldest. I mean, it's how many times do we have to prove to these non-native, to the government to say, you guys ever use that land? Sure, we use that land. We were up in Coffee Creek. We were all up. My dad was up in Ajax. Do I pick that land? No. I respect them. That's their land. Even though my dad was there, wandered around through there. Coffee Creek, all the way up. And we have members in William Peters' family that lived in Dawson and born on an island there, all the way all over the country. But we didn't pick that land. We just said, okay, government wanted you to pick that, draw lines between us. And it creates animosity, creates arguments. And every time you try to talk to somebody in the next village or something, it's always a monetary issue now. It's always money. And it's not that. We try to keep, a fair distance away from anything that related to money. But, modern agreements in BC, for example, have far more fundings. There's more and better implementation funding in addition to physical transfer and other beneficial financial benefits. While Chapter 24 of the UFA contemplates self-government, in our view, one of the weaknesses of this model is the lack of consultation, engagement process off settlement lands. And that's one of the things that bugs me too, is that we have rights. Sure, we pick land A, B, C category lands, and we have traditional lands. How much rights do we have on C lands, on B lands, and a quantity of lands that we have? It doesn't add to nothing really. And my view, like when we were at negotiation, that we wanted to say in all our settlement lands, regardless of if it was category A or B, C, B lands, C lands. And it just seems like, sure, you have all the rights you have on the category A lands, but how much category lands do you have? And it's not that very big. It's not that big, huh? And as you go down the categories, you get less and less say on those lands. So by the time you hit the traditional lands, you have a say, but you don't have the last say, like I said. There's a lot. We could sit here talk about issues like all day about some of this stuff, but at the end of the day, we felt that, it wasn't fair to us. And we were at the bottom of the barrel. We didn't have no money coming in that would financially support us in our ventures to go out. We're not just thinking about investing in Yukon, because Yukon is really can't financially support 14 First Nations. Like, you can invest all you want in there, but you have to go outside. You have to go outside, and that's where our vision was at that time, was that if we ever get money, that we would invest, south of the border. And even that, we didn't even have money, for that. So at the end of the day, I think it was fair that we walked away, and that now the government has to look at us. We walked away from the UFA March 05. That was the last time we said we have nothing to do with that process. And now the government is talking. We want to go back to the table and on some of the program. But like I say, I really can't talk about it until we get a legal department to really, sit down with the government and say, okay, what can you talk about and what can you agree on?
Okay, we're getting down to the nitty-gritty here. I know a lot of you have other appointments to do, but I just want to conclude by saying that Ross River is not idly sitting by. The Casca, Upper Liard, Casca Dena Council are not idly sitting by either. We've launched a number of lawsuits with the federal, territorial, and provincial governments to make sure that our our rights are protected. And in saying that, when governments want you to go back to the table, those are some of the conditions that they want the First Nations to deal with before they sit down with the government. But I think they can look the other way if they have to, and they've done so in the past. And just last July, the Elders Council for Ross River Dena Council got together at one of our gathering places to talk about some of the hunting pressures that face our people and that face our traditional territory. And we made a decision to cut back on what was being allowed by the territorial government. And in doing that, we set a word out. We sent a word out saying, look, those regulations put together by the Yukon government does not necessarily suit us. We even took them to court about that several years ago. And, we've been talking about that since 1988. We asked the governments to our people are quite concerned about hunting pressures that our people face, and those are our stores, our meat. Our people face poverty right from across the country. That is our store. That's where we get our meat, and a lot of pressure is being put on those resources, and with that, so next year we're gonna speak more about just exactly what it is that our people want, and the government has to listen to that. So until such time as we get back to the table and be able to negotiate an agreement that's going to suit our people, then that's where it's going to be. So
Merci. I just wanted to say a couple things. I really appreciate both of your perspectives, and I really appreciate you being here and sharing your stories. While you were talking, there's so many questions and things that came up in my mind. Like for myself, like I said, I'm originally from northern Manitoba, and my community, we're under the numbered treaties. And I don't know how familiar you guys are all with the treaties, the numbered treaties across Canada, and how unique Yukon is in terms of land claim settlements and whatnot. But when I've heard elders speak about treaty agreements, like ours was signed in 1910, but really it was forged by the government. Our elders say, back then there was hardly anyone who spoke English, and the terms and the wordings within a lot of treaty agreements, like acre, longitude, latitude, mile, these are not terms that are easily translated into Indigenous languages. And so I really commend you guys for the life experience that you have from, where you were born, how you were raised as a kid, and the many, many changes that you've seen in your lives. And it's ongoing. And, for me, trying to comprehend all these terms and land claims, negotiations, and the politics behind it, it must have been such a steep learning curve. And, I think today for many Indigenous young people, we're still in that struggle of trying to balance Western education and trying to have these conversations with the colonial systems that we have to deal with, and also maintaining our Indigenous worldview, our Indigenous values, and what's important to us. And so for you two as leaders, you must have taken a lot of knowledge and and values from your elders, but you still had to try to negotiate ways. And I can just imagine the pressure it was from the government for people to sign right away. And I commend you guys for holding strong to what you really believe in. And so thank you very much for that. I don't know if there's any other comments you guys would like to make, or we could open up the floor to other questions that audience members might have. It's up to you guys. Any final questions? Is there any questions in the audience or comments?
Hello, my name's Brian Bell. I'm from Whitehorse, Yukon, born, raised here. I guess my question for you guys is, there's been 11 of the 14 First Nations have signed final agreement. There's been a decade since those have been signed and implemented and such. And I am a little bit aware of your guys' perspective as well, and your history, and learned a little bit more today. I'm just wondering your observations since that time that the other First Nations have signed final agreements, and to see how those First Nations are going, and how you guys see yours, because as time goes on, climate change is going to happen, populations are going to increase, there's going to be more development, and there's no agreement. So I just wanted to see or hear your guys' perspectives on that, since that time has changed with other nations.
Okay, thank you. Our perspective is we're going to maintain, where we're going to be going. In negotiations, the governments are talking about land, cash, compensation, and under the umbrella final agreement, there are other provisions also that we do not agree with. These, we call that fundamental issues for us and for our communities and for our people. And at some point in the future, the areas in question, I agree that there's going to be added pressure from developers. But the other thing is that we've got governments and industries working with us to try to get what we want. They understand where we're coming from, and they're a lot easier to deal with than the governments. So with that, we're going to maintain our status quo, and hopefully one day that we'll celebrate as well.
Yeah. When you look at it, and you have an agreement with someone, you want that agreement to be wrapped up as soon as possible, so that both sides would move on. And it's been like 40 years since 73, and I know it's not the First Nation that's dragging their feet. They agreed to what was on the table at that time, and then now it seems like every time you get a new government in, there's some sort of question that they want to question on that land claims. It seems like now that they signed it, they don't want to proceed and make do with it. They want to question everything, like that trap line at Carmax or Braeburn or somewhere. They were having an issue about that. It just seems like now that they want to challenge First Nation that signed the agreements on those agreements that they signed, which should be putting on the table and moving forward on it. And we're going to go on our merry way and negotiate what we think should be negotiated, and not negotiate what we think shouldn't be negotiated, which is our rights and title, and and the resources that come out of our land. We're not going to, like I say, criticize other First Nation, but it's the government and that should be moving these things forward, not the First Nations. They're trying their best for the last 40 years, trying to get some sort of an agreement. And like I say, if it was any other First Nations, not saying anything against anybody else, but you have foreigners coming into this country and bringing in their religion and their own, ways of life, and even government, governing themselves within their little communities and stuff. And Canada accepts that. It's like the RCMP. I mean, there's all of them supposed to be wearing hats, but they don't now. So why can't you have an Indian walking around with a feather sticking out of his head, being an RCMP? Like stuff like that. We see it, but they're changing all around us, but they seem to keep us on the side, saying, okay, you'll get something that you want eventually. Like I say, we're going to negotiate what we want to negotiate and how we want it, and how it's going to implement into our area. So it benefits us. Like I say, the UFA, when we went through it and looked at it for years and we negotiated, it just didn't work out for us. There's nothing there that would make us happy at all.
All right, well, I really would like to thank both of you for coming here today. Like I said, you both have a lot of knowledge, and I appreciate you sharing that knowledge with all of us today. I think that we've all learned quite a bit today, and have a better understanding as to why your First Nations made the decisions that you have, and what. I'm curious to know, actually, like what are some of the next steps do you foresee in the next little while, like for your First Nations or?
Well, for Ross River and probably Liard First Nation is that we said we're always open to negotiations. Every year we lose a lot of our human resources. The people that we rely on. Every year we lose those. One of the things I want to leave with those that are still in school, take a lot of notes. The discussions I've talked about today, I go back into my notes that I took back, 1981. It goes back to 1977. These are important. These are going to be important for you. At some point, you're going to rely on those, much the way I do. So it's a lot.
Yeah, I think White River's vision is just to go on and try to get an agreement that's going to be fair and benefit our First Nation, and make sure that our generations to come are, taken care of. Because a lot of times you sign an agreement now and you never be able to change it in the future. So you have to really, and my saying is that, I'm not going to negotiate everything that I have under my belt. I'm going to let a little bit out here and a little bit there, and I'm going to teach my kids the same thing. All my kids know that, they're not signing land claims till they get something that they feel good at, that it feels good in their heart that they did this and they did the best they can. But it's always going to be open-ended. It's never going to be a closed deal for White River. It's going to be open-ended, and I'm going to make sure the government knows that too. Thank you.
All right, Masicho, Sugasinla. So the next speaker series that's going to come up is on November 29th, and this event will focus on the Yukon Association of Non-Status Indians, otherwise known as YANSI. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming out today, and thank you.